When my mother took her last breath, I thought the worst pain of my life was over. I was completely wrong. The ink on her death certificate was barely dry when my sister Vanessa inherited our family estate and $50 million. That exact same night, while I was still wearing my black funeral dress, she dragged my only suitcase to the front door and threw it onto the wet pavement. "Get out of my house!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the wealthy Atlanta neighborhood. "You mean nothing to this family anymore." I did not cry, I did not beg. I simply walked into the night. What Vanessa and her arrogant husband did not know was that the suitcase they tossed out contained the very financial documents that would destroy their entire lives. And they had no idea that the final page of my mother's will was a legal trap designed specifically for them. My name is Naomi, and I am 32 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who thought they could break you. Trust me, you will want to hear how this arrogant couple lost everything in just a few days. The heavy oak door of our Buckhead mansion slammed open, shattering the quiet morning of the evening. The air inside was thick with the smell of wilted lilies, catered food, and expensive perfume from the funeral reception. I stood in the marble foyer, my feet aching from the black heels I had worn all day to bury the woman who gave me life. Suddenly, a loud crash startled the remaining family members. My heavy leather suitcase skidded across the polished floor and tumbled down the grand front steps, bursting open upon impact. My modest clothes spilled onto the damp driveway, soaking up the rain from earlier that afternoon. Vanessa stood at the top of the stairs, her designer morning gown flowing around her like a dark cape. Her face, usually camera-ready for her thousands of social media followers, was twisted in an ugly, resentful sneer. For 36 years, Vanessa had been the golden child, the perfect daughter, who could do no wrong in the eyes of our extended family. Now, with our mother gone, she was the newly crowned queen of the Davis Empire. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "I told you to pack your trash and leave," she hissed, making sure her voice was loud enough for the guests in the parlor to hear. "Mom is dead. There is nobody left to protect a useless parasite like you. This is my property now, and I refuse to breathe the same air as a failure." Behind her, leaning casually against the mahogany doorframe, was her husband Spencer. He was 39, a white man who called himself a venture capitalist, but mostly just spent my family wealth to fund his lavish lifestyle. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his aged bourbon, the ice clinking loudly in the tense silence. He looked me up and down with that familiar condescending smirk, the one he reserved for anyone he deemed beneath his tax bracket or social standing. "You should probably call an Uber." Naomi Spencer drawled, his voice dripping with fake sympathy and real malice. "Or maybe a city bus is more your speed these days. We simply do not house failures anymore. It is bad for the brand." The sheer audacity of his words hung heavily in the cold night air. A white man standing in my mother house, a magnificent estate built on the sweat and brilliance of a hard-working black woman telling her youngest daughter to take a bus. I glanced toward the parlor. A few aunts and cousins, including my mother's sister Aunt Denise, murmured in the background, but nobody stepped forward to intervene. Nobody ever stepped forward when Vanessa threw a tantrum. They were all too afraid of losing their spot on the family payroll or being cut off from the new $50 million fortune. I looked down at my clothes scattered on the cold concrete. I looked up at Vanessa, her chest heaving with manufactured outrage. I looked at Spencer swirling his expensive liquor with a look of absolute triumph. They expected me to break down. They wanted me to fall to my knees, to cry, to beg for a room in the basement or a small allowance. They needed my tears to validate their sudden surge of absolute power. But I denied them that satisfaction. I did not shed a single tear. My face remained a mask of absolute terrifying calm. The silence stretching between us became heavy, almost suffocating. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably on her designer heels, her triumphant smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. She did not understand my silence. She did not know that for the past 5 years, while she was busy posing for yacht pictures and Spencer was playing pretend businessman, I had been building a ruthless career in covert financial forensics. They thought I was a low-level accountant struggling to pay rent in a bad neighborhood. They had absolutely no idea that I tracked dirty money for a living and that I had been tracking theirs for months. I walked slowly down the steps, my posture perfectly straight, my head held high. I knelt onto the wet driveway and methodically folded my clothes back into the suitcase. Every single movement was deliberate and unhurried. I could feel their eyes burning into my back, confused by my lack of panic. When I clicked the brass lock shut, I stood up and met Vanessa's gaze. The blazing hostility in her eyes was met with the absolute freezing calm in mine. "Enjoy the house, Vanessa," I said, my voice steady and quiet enough that she had to lean in to hear it. "Make sure you keep it clean," Spencer scoffed, clearly unnerved by my lack of emotion. "Just get off the property before I call the cops for trespassing," he muttered, taking another quick, nervous sip of his drink. I did not give him the dignity of a response. I turned my back on the grand mansion I had grown up in, gripping the handle of my suitcase. I walked down the long, sweeping driveway without looking back once. I did not need to call an Uber or wait for a city bus. Just beyond the wrought iron gates, out of their line of sight, a sleek black Maybach was waiting for me in the shadows. My personal driver stepped out and opened the door, referring to me respectfully as boss. As I sank into the plush leather seats, I pulled out my phone and opened a highly encrypted file. The screen glowed in the darkness, reflecting endless lines of Spencer offshore bank transfers and Vanessa fraudulent credit lines. They thought they had just thrown me out like trash. In reality, they had just handed me the match to burn their fake empire to the ground. Before I could even reach the heavy wrought iron gates where my car was waiting in the shadows, a sharp voice cut through the sound of the falling rain. "Naomi, stop right there!" I paused, the heavy leather handle of my suitcase cutting into my palm. I turned slowly to see my Aunt Denise marching toward me down the wet driveway. She was flanked by my cousin Marcus and Uncle Jerome. They held large black umbrellas, their faces shadowed and grim. For a brief, foolish second, a normal person might have thought they were coming to help me. A normal person might have assumed my own blood relatives were rushing out to stop my sister from throwing me onto the street on the night of my mother's funeral. But I knew better. I knew this family. They were not coming to my rescue. They were coming to make sure I took the blame. Aunt Denise stopped a few feet in front of me, her eyes sweeping over my soaked clothes with obvious disgust. "Are you really just going to walk away like a stray dog?" she demanded, her voice tight with anger. "You are going to turn your back on your own family on a night like this? You have always been so unbelievably stubborn, Naomi. It is absolutely exhausting." I stared at her, letting the cold rain run down my face. Aunt Denise was my mother's younger sister, a woman who had never worked a day in her life, surviving entirely on the allowance my mother provided. Now that Vanessa held the purse strings, Denise was eager to prove her absolute loyalty to the new queen. "Why do you always have to provoke your sister?" Denise continued, pointing a finger at me. "Vanessa is inside sobbing. She just buried her mother today, and instead of comforting her, you stand there with that cold, emotionless look on your face. You know she is fragile right now. You know how much pressure she is under. But you just had to make this entire evening about yourself, did you not?" The sheer level of delusion was almost impressive. My sister had just thrown my belongings out the front door and ordered her white husband to mock me, yet somehow I was the one making a scene. I looked at Marcus and Uncle Jerome. They refused to meet my eyes, staring at the wet pavement instead. They were grown men, both heavily in debt, both entirely dependent on the family business that Vanessa now controlled. Their silence was bought and paid for. "Your mother always said you were the difficult one," Denise sneered, stepping closer. "She gave you everything. She paid for your fancy private schools. She wanted you to be a prominent lawyer. And what did you do? You dropped out to become a low-level bookkeeper. You embarrassed her, Naomi. You have always been the black sheep, the scapegoat who never appreciated the sacrifices this family made. Look at Vanessa. She married a successful venture capitalist. She stayed by your mother's side. She is the pride and joy of the Davis family. And you are just a bitter, jealous little girl. Denise crossed her arms, the diamonds on her wrists catching the faint light from the porch. Now, she said, using the tone of a scolding parent, you are going to march back up those stairs. You are going to apologize to Spencer for your disrespectful silence. You are going to beg your sister for forgiveness. If you get on your knees and show some genuine remorse, I will personally ask Vanessa to let you stay in the guest house until you find a cheap apartment. Do not ruin this family reputation because of your foolish pride. I stood there in the pouring rain, listening to the woman who shared my blood tell me to kneel before the sister who abused me. I analyzed them not as family members, but as the financial parasites they truly were. I knew exactly how much credit card debt Denise was hiding from her husband. I knew Marcus had embezzled money from his own charity. I knew Uncle Jerome was 3 months behind on his mortgage. They were terrified. They were violently defending Vanessa because she was the only thing standing between them and total financial ruin. They did not love her. They were held hostage by her bank account. Aunt Denise, I said quietly, my voice slicing through the heavy rain. The only reason you are standing out here getting your designer shoes wet is because you are terrified Vanessa will cut off your monthly $10,000 allowance. Denise gasped, her eyes widening in shock. Marcus' head snapped up, and Uncle Jerome took a step back. You think I am the one walking away with nothing? I continued, my tone completely flat and devoid of any anger. You think Vanessa and Spencer are the saviors of this family? I actually feel sorry for you. When their entire fake empire crumbles, and it will crumble very soon, do not come looking for the black sheep to bail you out. Keep that same loyalty you are showing right now. How dare you speak to me like that? Denise shrieked, her face turning an ugly shade of red. You are nothing. You hear me? You are nothing but a broke, ungrateful mistake. I did not reply. I simply turned around and walked the remaining few yards to the heavy iron gates. Denise yelled after me, telling me I was dead to the family, but her words faded into the background noise of the storm. As I stepped past the brick pillars, the shadows of the street parted. The sleek black Maybach silently rolled forward, its headlights illuminating the heavy rain. Behind me, the screaming abruptly stopped. I could feel the collective shock radiating from Denise, Marcus, and Jerome. My personal driver, a tall, imposing man named David, stepped out of the luxury vehicle wearing a tailored suit. He opened a massive black umbrella and held it over my head, completely shielding me from the storm. He reached down, took my soaked suitcase with one hand, and opened the rear door of the Maybach with the other. Good evening, boss, David said respectfully, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet night. Everything is prepared for you at the penthouse. Thank you, David, I replied smoothly. I paused right before stepping into the warm leather interior. I slowly turned my head to look back at my relatives. They were frozen in place like statues, their umbrellas tilting to the side, the rain washing over their stunned faces. Their mouths were slightly open. They recognized a $500,000 car when they saw it. They recognized the deference of an elite private driver. In that single silent moment, the illusion they held of my pathetic, broke existence shattered into 1,000 pieces. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply broke eye contact, slid into the spacious back seat, and let the heavy door thud shut behind me. As the car smoothly accelerated away from the estate, I opened my encrypted laptop. Aunt Denise thought I was a difficult scapegoat. She was about to find out that I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner of their entire financial reality. The rain pounded against the tinted windows of the Maybach as we navigated through the dark streets of Buckhead, leaving the sprawling estate and my screaming relatives far behind. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, completely insulated from the storm outside and the toxic drama I had just escaped. I stared at the glowing skyline of Atlanta, a city built on hustle, ambition, and hidden money. David navigated the luxury vehicle smoothly down Peachtree Street, eventually pulling into the private, highly secured underground garage of one of the most exclusive architectural masterpieces in Midtown. The biometric scanner flashed green, instantly recognizing my fingerprint. The private glass elevator shot up directly to the top floor, bypassing the lobby entirely. I stepped out of the elevator and directly into my sanctuary. My penthouse was a 6,000 square foot fortress of glass, steel, and Italian marble suspended in the sky. I had bought it completely in cash a year ago. The sleek minimalist furniture, the museum-quality art pieces hanging on the walls, the sweeping, uninterrupted panoramic views of the city skyline. Absolutely none of this was supposed to belong to the difficult black sheep of the Davis family. For years, I had deliberately let them believe I lived in a cramped studio apartment on the wrong side of town, struggling to make ends meet as a freelance bookkeeper doing tax returns for small diners. It was the perfect unbreakable cover. People tend to ignore you when they think you have absolutely nothing to offer them. They do not ask questions. They do not dig into your life. And in my specific line of work, being invisible was my greatest, most lethal asset. I was not a lowly accountant. I was a senior financial forensics expert. Governments, elite corporate law firms, and international banking regulators hired my private firm to track the kind of dirty money that powerful, dangerous people kill to keep hidden. I dismantled offshore tax havens. I exposed white-collar syndicates. I traced every single digital footprint left behind by arrogant men who thought they were smarter than the system. And tonight my target was not a corrupt senator or a cartel boss. My target was family. I dropped my wet coat on a leather chair and walked straight into my command center. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint pulsing glow of the massive servers in the corner and three enormous curved monitors dominating my glass desk. I woke the system with a single keystroke and bypassed 3 layers of military-grade encryption. My fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard as I tapped directly into the global banking grid. Spencer thought he was a financial genius. He loved bragging at our tense family dinners about his elite venture capital firm, loudly dropping empty buzzwords like synergy angel investors and aggressive portfolio diversification. He commanded the room with the unearned confidence of a mediocre white man who had failed upwards his entire life. But I knew the actual truth about men exactly like him. They were empty suits, living entirely on credit leverage and extreme confidence. I entered the name of his primary holding company into my custom tracing software. The screen flickered instantly, running a complex algorithmic trace through dozens of international banking databases. I sat back and watched as the program brutally peeled back the layers of his pathetic financial facade. I found shell companies registered to fake addresses in Delaware. I found empty LLCs filed under the names of dead people. I found interconnected webs of dummy corporations designed to shuffle debt around to make it look like active revenue. Within minutes, the screens in front of me began to flash violently with rows of bright red numbers. Deficit after deficit, defaulted loans, overdrawn credit lines secured by entirely fraudulent assets. His so-called elite hedge fund was a hollow, rotting shell bleeding millions of dollars every single year. He was completely broke, but the true masterpiece of his stupidity was hidden beneath a secondary corporate account routed through a notoriously shady bank in the Cayman Islands. The encryption on this specific account was heavy, but it only took me 12 minutes to break through the firewall. I pulled the master ledger and cross-referenced the offshore account routing numbers with the internal financial ledger from my mother commercial real estate company. The matching serial numbers hit the screen, lighting up like a Christmas tree. I stopped typing. The realization hit me like a physical punch to the chest. Spencer had not just gone bankrupt through bad investments, he had been actively embezzling funds from my mother business for the past 3 years. He had siphoned away exactly $3.2 million right under Vanessa's perfectly contoured nose. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the red glow of the monitors reflecting intensely in my eyes. The arrogant man who had just stood on my childhood porch, sipping expensive bourbon and telling me to call a city bus, was headed straight for a federal penitentiary. He had the absolute audacity to call me a failure. He had the nerve to look down on me so incredibly comfortable in his unearned privilege while secretly stealing from the legacy built by a hard-working black woman. And Vanessa, in all her desperate, pathetic need for validation and high society status, was entirely blind to the monster sharing her bed. She was so obsessed with maintaining the fake image of a perfect power couple that she never once bothered to look at the actual spreadsheets. They had thrown me out tonight thinking they had won the war. They genuinely believed the $50 million inheritance was their untouchable golden ticket to a lifetime of extreme luxury. But as I saved the downloaded decrypted bank statements onto a secure flash drive, a slow, dangerous smile crept across my face. I held the nuclear launch codes to their entire existence right in the palm of my hand. The profound grief of losing my mother was still incredibly raw, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing against my chest. But the sharp, intoxicating thrill of impending justice provided a beautiful distraction. I did not need to scream, cry, or throw a tantrum on a wet driveway to prove my power. I just needed to let them hang themselves with their own monumental arrogance. I securely closed the laptop, the massive screens immediately fading to pitch black. I poured myself a glass of imported sparkling water, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, and looked down at the glittering city grid far below. Spencer and Vanessa were planning a massive, ostentatious party at the exclusive country club later this week to celebrate their new wealth and status. It was supposed to be their grand coronation into the elite circles of Atlanta. I decided right then and there that I would absolutely attend. They wanted a show. I was going to give them an absolute massacre. 3 days passed in a blur of meticulously calculated preparation. While Vanessa and Spencer spent their time ordering floral arrangements and booking caterers to celebrate their stolen victory, I spent my hours solidifying the absolute destruction of their future. The venue they chose for their grand coronation was the Magnolia Country Club, the most historically exclusive, rigidly guarded establishment in Atlanta. Membership required a 7-figure initiation fee and the unanimous approval of the board. My mother had fought for years to be accepted there, breaking through barriers of old Southern money just to secure her place. Now Vanessa was using our mother's sacred achievement as a stage to flaunt the $50 million she had not even legally received yet. She called it her new era celebration. I called it her final meal. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirrors in my penthouse, critically examining my reflection. For years, I had attended family functions wearing off-the-rack dresses and scuffed flats to maintain my illusion of financial struggle. Tonight, that illusion died. I wore a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that cascaded down my figure like liquid glass. Around my neck rested a vintage diamond choker, an auction piece I had acquired in Geneva the previous year. I looked exactly like the woman I truly was, a silent predator who owned every room she walked into. David was waiting for me in the underground garage. As the Maybach glided through the warm Atlanta night, I checked my phone one last time. Everything was perfectly in place. The Magnolia Country Club was glowing under the night sky, its massive white columns wrapped in imported white roses, just for Vanessa party. Valets were rushing to park a steady stream of Ferraris and Bentleys. When David pulled up to the red carpet, a valet rushed to open my door. I stepped out, the cool evening breeze catching the silk of my dress. The double oak doors were guarded by 2 large security men holding clipboards instructed specifically by Spencer to keep out anyone who did not fit the aesthetic. Or more specifically, to keep me out. I did not even pause as I walked up the marble steps. Before the security guards could raise a hand to stop me, a distinguished older gentleman with silver hair stepped out from the foyer. It was Richard Sterling, the president of the country club. I had done a highly discreet forensic audit for his private equity firm 6 months ago, quietly saving him from a $100 million embezzlement scandal. He owed me a favor, and men like Richard always paid their debts. Naomi, my dear, Richard said loudly, extending his arm to guide me past the bewildered security guards. It is an absolute honor to have you tonight. The guards immediately lowered their clipboards and stepped aside. I smiled warmly at Richard, thanking him for the personal invitation. We walked through the grand foyer and directly into the main ballroom. The sheer scale of the waste was staggering. Vanessa had ordered a massive ice sculpture of a swan, a 5-tier champagne tower, and a live jazz band playing on a raised stage. The room was packed with Atlanta elite politicians, socialites, and business moguls who were all eager to kiss the ring of the new $50 million heiress. Vanessa was standing near the center of the room wearing a blindingly loud sequined dress, loudly bragging to a group of state senators about her plans to restructure our mother company. Spencer was right beside her, holding a cigar he had not lit, puffing out his chest and pretending to understand high finance. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and casually walked toward the center of the room. It only took about 30 seconds for the whispering to start. Heads began to turn. The people in this room knew the Davis family dynamics. They knew the rumors that I was the broke estranged sister who had been disowned. Seeing me stand there dripping in diamonds and radiating absolute power completely shattered the narrative Vanessa had been selling them all night. Vanessa saw me just as she was taking a sip of her drink. She choked, coughing violently as the champagne went down the wrong pipe. Her eyes widened in absolute shock, her perfectly contoured face contorting into a mask of pure panic. Spencer followed her gaze, and his smug smile instantly dissolved. His face turned the color of old parchment. For a split second, they both looked like deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. Vanessa recovered her composure, but her anger was boiling just beneath the surface. She handed her glass to a waiter and marched directly toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. Spencer followed closely behind her, his jaw clenched tight. As they approached, the crowd naturally parted, sensing the impending collision. "What are you doing here?" Vanessa hissed, keeping her voice low but vibrating with rage. "Who let you in? Are you out of your mind coming here dressed like that? You are embarrassing me in front of my guests. You need to leave right now before I have you physically thrown out." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting my eyes wander over her loud, tacky dress. "I am just here to celebrate your new era, Vanessa," I said smoothly, my voice calm and perfectly measured. I wanted to see what $50 million of unearned confidence looks like up close. Spencer stepped forward, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "Listen to me very carefully, Naomi," he growled, pointing a thick finger at my face. "You are not on the guest list. You do not belong here. You are trespassing on a private event, and I am not going to let a jealous, broke little girl ruin my wife's celebration." "Security." He raised his hand, signaling the guards near the entrance. Several heavy-set men in black suits began pushing their way through the crowd toward us. The surrounding guests fell completely silent, watching the drama unfold with wide eyes. Vanessa smirked, crossing her arms, thoroughly enjoying the prospect of watching me get dragged out in front of the entire city elite. But before the security guards could even reach us, a booming voice echoed over the quiet murmurs of the crowd. "That will not be necessary, gentlemen." Richard Sterling, the club president, stepped into the circle, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. He looked at Spencer with a mixture of confusion and deep disdain. "Is there a problem here, Spencer? Naomi is my personal VIP guest for the evening. In fact, she is one of the most brilliant minds I have the pleasure of knowing. I insisted she join us tonight." The blood completely drained from Spencer's face. His hand dropped to his side. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. The crowd exchanged shocked whispers. The broke outcast sister was not a party crasher. She was personally protected by the most powerful man in the room. "Richard, I believe there has been some sort of massive misunderstanding here," Spencer stammered, his voice cracking slightly before he quickly cleared his throat to lower the pitch. He forced a loud, booming chuckle, the exact kind of hollow, condescending laugh designed to dismiss a woman in a corporate boardroom. He stepped directly between me and the club president, physically trying to block me from Richard's line of sight. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his height and his tailored tuxedo to assert dominance. You see, Richard, Naomi here is my sister-in-law. She has a long, tragic history of making a scene at family functions. She has been going through a very difficult time financially, and she tends to lash out. We are just trying to protect the dignity of the evening and shield the guests from her outbursts. This is a private family matter, and as the head of this family, I really must insist she is escorted off the premises. He aggressively adjusted his expensive cufflinks, trying to project the image of a reasonable, wealthy white man burdened by an erratic, hysterical black relative. He looked around at the other older white men in the vicinity, offering them a knowing, conspiratorial smile, trying to establish a silent boys' club alliance. You know how it is in our line of work. Richard Spencer continued, his tone shifting into a sleazy fake camaraderie. In the high-stakes venture capital space, we have to meticulously manage risk. We simply cannot afford wildcard distractions. Naomi is a reputational risk to this family and to this club. I am sure you understand. Richard did not smile back. He did not nod. He simply looked at Spencer with a chilling expression of absolute disgust. The only risk I see in this beautiful room, Spencer, is your appalling lack of manners, Richard said coldly. He took a deliberate step back, crossing his arms and giving me the floor, fully aware that I was more than capable of handling a fragile ego like Spencer. Deprived of the wealthy white male solidarity he was so desperately banking on, Spencer turned his frustration entirely on me. His polite facade completely dissolved. He stepped dangerously close to me, invading my personal space in a blatant attempt to physically intimidate me. "Listen to me, you pathetic little fraud," he hissed under his breath, his face turning an angry shade of red. "I do not know whose bed you had to crawl into to get past the front gate, but you are out of your league. You do not belong in this world. You are a broke, irrelevant bookkeeper, and you will never see a single dime of that $50 million. Now turn around and walk out the door before I completely destroy whatever miserable life you have left." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I looked up into his angry, sweating face and took a slow, elegant sip of my champagne. "You talk a lot about risk management, Spencer," I said, my voice cutting through the soft jazz music like a razor blade. "But I have to admit, I am genuinely fascinated by your personal investment strategies. You see, I was just reading up on some of your recent corporate acquisitions." "You do not know the first thing about high-level finance, Naomi," he sneered, though a tiny bead of sweat suddenly appeared at his hairline. "Stick to your little diner tax returns and let the real men handle the capital." I smiled, a slow, predatory curve of my lips that made his eyes dart nervously. "I suppose you are right," I replied, my tone dripping with feigned innocence. "I am just a simple numbers girl." But even a simple numbers girl knows that aggressively moving capital into a ghost entity in the Cayman Islands is a rather bold strategy. Spencer completely froze. The smug, condescending sneer vanished from his face in a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. His breathing stopped. The hand holding his unlit cigar began to visibly tremble. "I mean, it takes an incredible amount of synergy." I continued, raising my voice just enough so that Vanessa and the group of state senators standing nearby could hear every single word clearly. "Funneling exactly $3.2 million into an offshore shell company that has absolutely zero operational history, no physical office, and not a single legitimate client. That takes serious talent. What was the name of that holding company again? Apex Global Solutions? Or was it Apex Holdings? It is so hard to keep track of all those invisible accounts." The color drained entirely from Spencer's face, leaving him looking like a sick ghost. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. He opened his mouth to speak, to call me a liar, to scream for security, but absolutely no sound came out. His vocal cords were paralyzed by the realization that I knew his deepest, darkest secret, the secret that was supposed to be buried under layers of unbreakable international encryption. Vanessa, sensing the sudden, unnatural silence from her usually loud husband, stepped forward. Her brow was furrowed in genuine confusion. "What is she talking about?" Vanessa demanded, looking back and forth between us. "What Cayman account? What $3 million?" Spencer jolted as if he had been electrocuted. He desperately grabbed Vanessa by the elbow, trying to pull her away from me. "Nothing, babe. It is absolutely nothing," he stammered, his voice pitching high with poorly concealed panic. "She is just throwing out random financial words she heard on a podcast. She is crazy, Vanessa. I told you she was mentally unstable. We need to go mingle with the mayor. Let us go." He practically dragged his wife away, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor in his haste to escape my gaze. Vanessa stumbled in her heels, looking back at me over her shoulder with a mixture of intense anger and sudden creeping suspicion. The seed of absolute doubt had been firmly planted in her mind. The crowd around us murmured in hushed, excited tones, sensing the crack in the perfect foundation of the Davis family empire. I stood in the center of the ballroom, completely untouched, my diamond choker glittering under the crystal chandeliers. I raised my glass slightly in a silent toast to his retreating back. He had tried to put me in my place using his privilege and his arrogance. Instead, he had just realized that I was the one holding the leash, and I was going to pull it tight at the lawyer office tomorrow morning. The absolute silence in the ballroom was deafening. Spencer looked like a man who had just stared down the barrel of a loaded gun. He slowly backed away, blending into the crowd of onlookers, his previous bravado completely shattered by the mere mention of his offshore secrets. But Vanessa was an entirely different kind of animal. Where Spencer panicked under pressure, Vanessa doubled down with vicious pride. She could feel the collective gaze of Atlanta high society shifting in real time. She could sense the power dynamic slipping through her fingers. In her mind, this was her grand coronation, her absolute moment of triumph, and she was not about to let the sister she despised steal her spotlight or humiliate her husband. Her shock quickly morphed into a desperate, toxic need to assert her dominance over the room. She turned her back on me, her heavy sequined dress catching the light as she marched furiously toward the raised stage where the live jazz band was waiting. She practically shoved the saxophone player aside to get to the center microphone stand. She grabbed a heavy silver spoon from a nearby dessert tray and began aggressively tapping it against her crystal champagne flute. The sharp, ringing sound echoed through the massive ballroom, demanding absolute attention. The remaining whispers from the elite crowd instantly died down. Every single eye in the room locked onto her. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Vanessa began, her voice projecting loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system. She forced a bright plastic smile, though her eyes were still burning with venom as she glared in my direction. She took a deep theatrical breath, perfectly slipping into her carefully crafted role as the grieving but incredibly strong daughter. "As you all know, this has been an unimaginably difficult week for the Davis family. We laid my beautiful, brilliant mother to rest just a few days ago. She was a true pioneer in commercial real estate, a visionary Black woman who built a massive empire from the ground up, and she entrusted the future of that entire empire exclusively to me." A polite ripple of applause swept through the room. Vanessa soaked it in like a sponge, her posture straightening, her fragile ego instantly inflating with the public validation she craved so deeply. She looked out over the sea of wealthy politicians, investors, and business moguls, her gaze deliberately scanning until it landed squarely on me again. I stood perfectly still next to Richard Sterling, my expression completely unreadable. "Stepping into my mother's shoes is a monumental task," Vanessa continued, her tone shifting from fake mourning to ruthless corporate ambition. "But I am more than ready. Effective immediately, I will be taking over as the sole Chief Executive Officer of Davis Commercial Enterprises, and let me be perfectly clear with everyone in this room tonight. We are entering a brand new era. We are going to be restructuring the entire organization from the top down. I plan on completely cleaning house, cutting the dead weight, and aggressively modernizing our real estate portfolio. We are no longer carrying the burden of underperforming assets, and we are certainly no longer carrying people who do not actively contribute to our bottom line. She paused intentionally, making sure the entire room followed her line of sight, directly to where I was standing. The crowd parted slightly, leaving me isolated in a clear, unobstructed path of her public venom. It is a heavy burden, being the only responsible child, Vanessa said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy that barely concealed her pure malice. We all have that one family member, do we not? The cautionary tale. The one who drops out of school, who lacks any real ambition, who expects the family name and the family bank account to carry them through life while they contribute absolutely nothing to society. My mother loved my sister Naomi, despite her many, many failures. She kept her afloat for years out of guilt and pity. But that charity officially ends today. This company and this family will no longer subsidize laziness or reward incompetence. We are moving forward focused solely on excellence, massive wealth, and building a dynasty. So please join me in a toast to the future. She raised her glass high into the air, a triumphant smirk plastered across her face. A few of her closest sycophants and paid friends raised their glasses in response, but the majority of the room remained perfectly still. The tension was so thick it felt suffocating. The elite crowd was watching me intently. They were all waiting for my reaction. They expected a reality television moment. They fully expected me to scream, to throw my drink to defend my honor, or to run out of the ballroom crying in complete humiliation. They wanted a messy, dramatic show to gossip about at their country club brunches tomorrow. But I did not give them a show. I did not feel a single ounce of anger, shame, or humiliation. Standing there listening to her publicly declare her victory and tear down my character, I actually felt a profound, untouchable sense of peace. Because I knew a massive secret that she did not. I knew that every single arrogant word coming out of her mouth was a complete fantasy. She was bragging about a company she did not legally control. She was boasting about $50 million that was already slipping through her perfectly manicured fingers with every second that ticked by. She was the arrogant captain of the Titanic, proudly giving a victory speech while the ship was already sinking straight to the bottom of the ocean. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The crowd held its breath. Vanessa lowered her glass slightly, her eyes narrowing, bracing herself for the screaming match she so desperately wanted. I looked at her standing on that stage, desperate for approval, entirely toxic and utterly oblivious to the massive legal trap that had already snapped shut around her ankles. I raised my own champagne flute, the fine crystal catching the light of the overhead chandeliers. I did not shout. I did not need a microphone to command the room. I projected my voice clearly and calmly across the dead-silent ballroom, making absolutely sure that every single syllable carried the heavy weight of an impending execution. "Enjoy tonight, Vanessa," I said, a serene, chilling smile spreading slowly across my face. "Drink the expensive champagne, soak in the applause. Have the absolute time of your life tonight, because I will see you at the lawyer office tomorrow morning." I did not wait for her response. I did not stay to watch the confusion wash over her face, or to hear the sudden eruption of shocked whispers that immediately filled the room behind me. I simply lowered my glass, turned on my heel, and walked out of the ballroom. The crowd parted for me, like the Red Sea stepping back to let me pass. Richard Sterling gave me a small, respectful nod of approval as I walked by him. I walked out the grand oak doors, down the sweeping marble steps, and back into the cool Atlanta night, where my driver was already holding the door to the Maybach open for me. I had planted the seed of absolute terror in their minds tonight. Tomorrow morning, I was going to watch it destroy them. The morning sun sliced through the heavy wooden blinds of Attorney Harrison downtown Atlanta office, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany conference table. The room smelled of old money leather and fresh coffee. I had arrived exactly 15 minutes early, wearing a sharp, tailored black suit that projected absolute business authority. I sat quietly in a high-backed leather chair in the corner of the room, sipping my black coffee, the encrypted flash drive resting heavily in my jacket pocket. My mind was completely clear. There was no anxiety, no lingering sadness, and absolutely no doubt. I was just waiting for the rats to walk into the trap. They made me wait for 45 minutes. That was a classic Spencer power move, a cheap negotiation tactic he had read in some airport business book. Make the other party wait so they feel inferior. But I was not an anxious client. I was the executioner, and the executioner always has time. When the heavy oak doors finally swung open, the peaceful quiet of the law office was instantly shattered. Vanessa and Spencer practically burst into the room, bringing a chaotic, offensive energy with them. They looked like a walking billboard for new money desperation. Vanessa was wearing a ridiculously tight designer dress that was far more appropriate for a nightclub than a legal proceeding, complete with massive dark sunglasses that covered half her face. She smelled strongly of stale champagne, expensive perfume, and an undeniable undercurrent of nervous sweat. Spencer was wearing a loud custom pinstripe suit, with a brightly colored silk pocket square. His eyes were bloodshot from the drinking the night before, but his jaw was clenched tight with aggressive, unearned confidence. They did not even apologize for their extreme tardiness. Spencer immediately marched over to the head of the conference table, pulling out the largest chair for himself, as if he were the senior partner of the firm. He aggressively tossed his leather briefcase onto the polished wood, letting it slap loudly against the surface. Vanessa sank into the chair next to him dramatically, letting out an exhausted sigh. She finally took off her oversized sunglasses, immediately locking her bloodshot eyes onto me. Her glare was pure poison. After our confrontation at the country club the previous night, she had clearly spent the entire morning convincing herself that I was just a bitter, jealous sibling trying to ruin her big moment. "Why is she even sitting here?" Vanessa spat, pointing a manicured finger in my direction, without even bothering to say hello. "This reading is for beneficiaries only." Mom gave her absolutely nothing. "Get her out of this room." Before I could even respond, Attorney Harrison walked into the conference room. He was a distinguished man in his late 60s, a brilliant legal mind who had managed my mother's massive real estate portfolio for over 2 decades. He carried a thick manila folder and possessed the calm, unflappable demeanor of a man who had seen every possible variation of family greed. He took his seat opposite Spencer and placed the folder carefully on the desk. "Good morning, Vanessa Spencer, Naomi," Mr. Harrison said smoothly, completely ignoring Vanessa. "Demand to kick me out. Thank you all for being here today. I understand emotions are running very high given the recent passing of Beatrice, but we have a legal obligation to formally execute the final directives of her estate." Spencer let out a loud, obnoxious groan, throwing his hands up in the air. "Look, Harrison, let us just cut the absolute nonsense," he interrupted, his voice booming, with the entitled resonance of a man who was used to getting his way simply by being the loudest white man in the room. "We do not need a 3-hour history lesson or some emotional therapy session. My wife is now the chief executive officer of a massive commercial real estate empire. We have an entire board of directors waiting for us downtown to discuss aggressive corporate restructuring. We do not have time for your billable hours. Just skip all the dense legal jargon, slide the paperwork across the table, and cut the damn check." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air. He was sitting in the office of a man who had been my mother's trusted advisor for 20 years, speaking to him like he was a slow waiter at a fast food restaurant. It was the absolute pinnacle of white privilege and unearned arrogance. He felt entirely untouchable. Mr. Harrison simply blinked, adjusting his reading glasses. He did not rise to the bait. He did not raise his voice. He simply opened the thick folder. "Mr. Sterling, this is a highly complex estate involving $50 million in liquid assets, several massive commercial properties, and the controlling shares of a major corporation. The law requires that I read the stipulations clearly to all parties involved, including Naomi, as she is listed as a potential secondary beneficiary under specific conditions." Spencer let out a harsh, barking laugh, slapping the table. "Secondary beneficiary? Are you kidding me right now? She is a broke bookkeeper who got thrown out of the house 3 days ago." Beatrice hated her lack of ambition. That is why she left everything to Vanessa. There are no conditions that matter. Just transfer the titles and wire the 50 million into our primary joint account. We already gave the routing numbers to your paralegal. Vanessa chimed in, leaning over the table, her voice dripping with venom. Exactly. We have plans, Mr. Harrison. Big plans. My mother wanted me to elevate this family to the next level, and I cannot do that if my useless sister is sitting here trying to leech off my inheritance. Read whatever you have to read so we can sign the dotted line and leave her in the dust where she belongs. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, letting their toxic arrogance fill the room. I did not defend myself. I did not interrupt their pathetic display of greed. I just watched Spencer aggressively tap his gold watch, rolling his eyes as Mr. Harrison began to read the standard introductory legal clauses. They were both practically salivating, their eyes locked onto the thick stack of papers, dreaming of yachts, country club memberships, and endless luxury. They were so incredibly eager to grab the money that they had completely forgotten the golden rule of dealing with my mother. Beatrice Davis never gave anything away for free. Read it, Mr. Harrison, I said softly from my corner, my voice breaking the tension in the room. Read every single word. I want them to hear exactly what my mother left them. Spencer shot me a filthy look, a condescending sneer curling his upper lip. Just keep your mouth shut, Naomi. You are only here to witness your own absolute failure. I smiled warmly at him. Let us see about that. Mr. Harrison let out a slow, measured breath, completely ignoring the toxic exchange between us. He adjusted his silver-rimmed reading glasses, smoothed the thick parchment paper flat against the mahogany table, and began to read in a deep, authoritative voice that commanded the room. I, Beatrice Eleanor Davis, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this document to be my last will and testament, revoking all prior wills and codicils. The dense legal language filled the quiet office, detailing the incredible scope of the empire my mother had built from absolutely nothing. Harrison read through the initial formalities, the minor charitable donations, and the small trust funds set aside for the extended family members, like Aunt Denise. Every time he mentioned a sum of money going to someone else, Vanessa gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white, practically vibrating with greedy impatience. She did not care about the charities or her aunts. She only cared about her payout. Then Harrison turned the page. We have reached the primary distribution of the estate, he announced, looking directly at Vanessa. Regarding the controlling shares of Davis Commercial Enterprises, the primary family residence located in Buckhead, and the accumulated liquid assets currently held in private banking trusts. Spencer actually leaned forward in his chair, his mouth slightly open, looking like a starving dog staring at a piece of raw meat. Harrison cleared his throat and read the exact words Vanessa had been dying to hear. I hereby bequeath the entirety of my commercial real estate portfolio, the deed to the Buckhead estate, and the sum of $50 million to my eldest daughter, Vanessa Davis Sterling. For a fraction of a second, the room was completely silent. Then an ear-piercing scream of pure, unadulterated joy erupted from Vanessa. She shot out of her leather chair, throwing her arms up toward the ceiling as if she had just won an Olympic gold medal. Oh my God, she shrieked, tears of overwhelming greed streaming down her perfectly contoured face. $50 million! $50 million! Spencer jumped up right beside her. He grabbed her by the waist, lifting her off the ground and kissing her passionately right in the middle of the formal law office. They were laughing hysterically, completely abandoning any sense of decorum, dignity, or respect for the woman who had actually died to leave them this wealth. We did it, babe, Spencer yelled, pumping his fist in the air like a frat boy at a college football game. We own this city now. We are untouchable. They celebrated wildly for 2 full minutes, while Mr. Harrison sat perfectly still, his hands folded neatly over the open folder. I remained quietly in my corner, sipping my coffee, watching the pathetic display of unearned triumph. Eventually, their ecstatic celebration shifted exactly where I knew it would. They turned their attention to me. The joy on Vanessa's face twisted into a cruel, deeply vindictive sneer. She walked over to where I was sitting, crossing her arms and looking down at me as if I were a piece of garbage stuck to the bottom of her expensive designer shoe. "Did you hear that, Naomi?" Vanessa asked, her voice dripping with venom and absolute superiority. "Did you hear exactly what Mom thought of you? $50 million for me. And absolutely nothing for you. You did not even get a mention. She did not even leave you enough to buy a cheap used car. You are a complete zero in this family. You always have been, and now it is legally binding." Spencer walked up behind his wife, wrapping a possessive arm around her waist, completely drunk on the power of the moment. "I told you to stay home, Naomi." He laughed, his face flushed red with adrenaline. "But I am actually glad you came. I am glad you got to sit there in your fake little business suit and watch my wife inherit an empire. It is the closest you will ever get to real wealth. You know what we are going to do first. We are going to bulldoze that old rose garden you and Beatrice used to plant together. We are going to pave right over it and build a private tennis court. And then we are going to sell off every single charity project she started. We are liquidating it all to fund our new lifestyle, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop us." Vanessa leaned closer to me, her voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper. "Mom knew you were a failure. That is why she trusted me with everything. She knew you were too weak, too pathetic, and too unambitious to handle real money. You were a massive disappointment to her every single day of her life. And now that she is gone, I am going to make sure your name is completely erased from this family legacy. Do not ever try to contact me again. Do not show up at my country club. Do not call my husband. From this second forward, you are completely dead to me. Now take your cheap little briefcase and get the hell out of my sight before I have security drag you out of this building." Spencer laughed loudly at his wife's words. "Do you need a loan for the bus fare back to your terrible apartment?" he mocked, digging his hand into his pocket and pulling out a crisp $100 bill. He crumpled it into a ball and tossed it directly at my chest. It bounced off my lapel and landed on the floor. "Take it. Consider it your entire inheritance. Buy yourself something nice. Maybe a new calculator for your depressing little bookkeeping job. You are a joke, Naomi. You have always been a joke. Now run along and let the real adults handle the $50 million. Their perceived victory had reached its absolute peak. They were standing at the very top of the mountain, beating their chests, completely blinded by their own greed and arrogance. They had just spent the last 5 minutes unleashing every toxic, hateful thought they had ever harbored against me. They had insulted our mother, memory threatened to destroy her charitable legacy, and attempted to strip me of every ounce of my human dignity. To them, this was the ultimate triumph. They had completely won the war, and I was utterly defeated. I looked down at the crumpled $100 bill on the floor. I looked up at Spencer's flushed, triumphant face. Then I looked at Vanessa, who was glowing with the toxic satisfaction of finally destroying her younger sister. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply picked up my coffee cup, took a slow, deliberate sip, and gently placed it back onto the saucer. I shifted my gaze past them, looking directly at the elderly lawyer, who was still sitting quietly at the head of the table. Mr. Harrison's face gave absolutely nothing away, but I could see the faint, almost imperceptible glimmer of anticipation in his eyes. "Please excuse the interruption, Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice cutting through the thick, gloating atmosphere of the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. "I believe you have not finished reading the document. There is still one more page left in that folder, is there not?" Spencer let out another harsh bark of laughter, shaking his head in mock pity. "You are completely delusional, Naomi. There is no secret page. You watch too many soap operas. Harrison, just tell her she gets absolutely nothing so we can sign these papers and leave." Mr. Harrison did not laugh. He did not close the thick folder. Instead, he slowly and deliberately turned to the very last page of the document. The faint glimmer of anticipation I had noticed in his eyes earlier hardened into a look of absolute, unyielding sternness. He looked up at my sister over the silver rim of his glasses. Vanessa, he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the heavy, inescapable weight of a judge about to deliver a severe sentence. Did you actually bother to read the final page of the advanced copy we sent to your house? Vanessa frowned, her triumphant smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. I read the part that mattered, she snapped defensively, adjusting her posture in the expensive chair. The part where I get the $50 million and the company. What difference does some standard legal disclaimer make at the end of the document? It is not a disclaimer, Mr. Harrison corrected her smoothly. It is a strict contingency clause. And I strongly suggest you listen very carefully because it dictates the entire future of your newly acquired wealth. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet instantly. Spencer slowly lowered his arm from around Vanessa's waist. He sank back down into his leather chair, the arrogant flush rapidly leaving his face. Vanessa stood perfectly frozen, her eyes locked onto the piece of parchment paper in the lawyer hands. Beatrice was a brilliant businesswoman. Mr. Harrison began reading the preamble of the final clause. She understood the immense value of her assets, but more importantly, she understood the exact nature of the people she was leaving those assets to. She instructed me to draft a highly specific condition regarding the primary distribution of her estate. He cleared his throat and began to read directly from the will. The transfer of the $50 million liquid assets and the ownership of Davis Commercial Enterprises to my eldest daughter, Vanessa Davis Sterling, is strictly contingent upon one absolute condition. Vanessa must allow my youngest daughter, Naomi Davis, to reside completely rent-free and undisturbed in the primary Buckhead family estate for a minimum of 5 consecutive years following my death. Vanessa's mouth dropped open. A sharp, breathless gasp escaped her lips. Spencer gripped the heavy mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. Mr. Harrison was not finished. He raised his hand slightly to prevent any interruptions and continued reading the devastating legal text. Vanessa is legally forbidden from evicting Naomi, changing the locks, harassing her into leaving, or physically removing her belongings from the property. Should Vanessa violate this specific condition at any point during the 5-year period, the initial inheritance clause becomes entirely null and void. The absolute silence that followed those words was deafening. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a massive explosion, the ringing in your ears right before the shockwave actually hits you. But the shockwave was still coming. And what happens if the clause is violated? Spencer asked, his voice reduced to nothing more than a raspy, terrified whisper. His unearned confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a deep, suffocating dread. Mr. Harrison flipped the page, his expression remaining entirely neutral and professional. If the condition of cohabitation is violated, the entirety of the $50 million estate, the commercial real estate portfolio, and the Buckhead mansion will be immediately seized and transferred into an irrevocable blind trust. The sole appointed trustee and the exclusive beneficiary of that trust will be Naomi Davis. Total absolute collapse. The color drained from Vanessa's face so incredibly fast, she looked like she was about to pass out right there on the expensive oriental rug. Her legs gave out completely, and she collapsed heavily back into her chair, her perfectly manicured hands trembling uncontrollably. The massive empire she had just bragged about to the entire city, the private tennis courts she planned to build, the luxury yachts, the high society status she craved so deeply. It was all tied directly to the sister she despised. The sister she had just spent the last 10 minutes viciously insulting. The sister she had literally thrown out into the pouring rain just 3 days ago. No, Vanessa stammered, shaking her head frantically from side to side. No, that cannot be right. You are reading it wrong. Let me see that paper. Give me that paper right now. She lunged forward across the table, desperately trying to snatch the document from the lawyer's hands. Mr. Harrison smoothly pulled the folder back, keeping it safely out of her reach. I assure you, Vanessa, I drafted this document myself, he said firmly. Your mother signed it in my presence, and it was officially notarized by 2 independent witnesses. Her instructions were incredibly clear. She wanted to ensure that you did not abandon your younger sister. She wanted to force this family to stay together under one roof, or force you to forfeit the fortune. This is a forgery, Spencer suddenly shouted, leaping to his feet. His face was a mask of pure panic and desperate fury. She paid you to write this, did she not? Naomi paid you to slip this fake page into the will. I am going to have you disbarred, Harrison. I am going to call the federal authorities and have you investigated for fraud. Mr. Harrison leveled a cold, deeply intimidating glare at the desperate white man standing across from him. I would highly advise you to watch your tone in my office, Mr. Sterling. Accusing a senior partner of a major law firm of felony fraud is a very dangerous game. This will is ironclad. If you wish to contest it, you are welcome to spend the next decade drowning in endless legal fees. But until a federal judge says otherwise, these are the legally binding terms of the Beatrice Davis estate. Vanessa was hyperventilating now. Her chest heaved heavily as her mind raced desperately, trying to process the catastrophic reality of her situation. She looked over at me, sitting quietly in the corner, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and sudden, sickening realization. The arrogant sneer was completely gone, replaced by the panicked look of a trapped animal. She finally realized that the trap had already sprung. She remembered the heavy leather suitcase sliding across the marble foyer and tumbling down the wet stairs. She remembered screaming at me to get out of her house at the top of her lungs. She remembered standing on the porch with her husband, happily watching me walk away into the storm. And she suddenly realized why I had not fought back, why I had not cried. I had simply packed my clothes and left without a word, permanently securing my position as the victim of a hostile eviction. "Wait!" Vanessa gasped, her voice cracking as she desperately tried to rewrite history in real time. "Wait a minute. I did not kick her out. She left. She packed her own bags and walked away voluntarily. I never told her to leave the property. I swear to God, Mr. Harrison, she chose to leave the house all on her own. That means she violated the condition, not me. I still get the money. It is mine." She looked up at Spencer, her eyes silently begging him to back up her frantic lie. Spencer caught on immediately, nodding aggressively. "Yes, exactly. She left on her own accord. She was acting erratic and just stormed out after the funeral. We practically begged her to stay. We offered her the best guest room in the house. She is just trying to manipulate the terms of the will to steal what belongs to my wife." They were lying through their teeth, desperately throwing a Hail Mary pass to salvage their $50 million fantasy. But I had anticipated this exact reaction. I remained perfectly calm in my corner seat, my eyes dropping briefly to the crumpled $100 bill Spencer had thrown at me earlier. I slowly reached into my tailored suit jacket, my fingers brushing against the cold, hard edge of my smartphone. The trap was fully set, and they were about to realize there was absolutely no way out. I pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket, the smooth glass cool against my fingertips. Across the table, Vanessa and Spencer were still frantically spinning their web of lies, their voices overlapping in a desperate bid to convince the lawyer of their absolute innocence. "She was completely hysterical, Mr. Harrison," Vanessa insisted, placing her hands flat on the table and leaning forward to project earnestness. I tried to calm her down. "I told her we needed to stick together as a family, but she just started screaming about how she hated the house and hated all of us. She dragged her own suitcase down the stairs and ran out into the storm. I even ran after her, begging her to stay." "It is the absolute truth," Spencer chimed in, nodding solemnly, trying to mimic the grave tone of an honest man. "I stood right there on the porch and offered to call her a car. I offered to pay for a hotel if she just needed some space for the night. But she refused. She wanted to create a dramatic scene. You know how she is. She voluntarily abandoned the residence. I let them talk. I let them paint this elaborate, pathetic masterpiece of deception. They were digging a hole so deep there would be absolutely no climbing out." Mr. Harrison listened to them with a completely neutral expression, his pen hovering over a yellow legal pad. He did not nod. He did not agree. He simply let them exhaust their breath. When they finally stopped talking, leaving a heavy, anxious silence in the room, I placed my phone face up on the mahogany table. I looked directly at Mr. Harrison. My mother was a very cautious woman. I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady. When her health began to rapidly decline 2 years ago, she wanted to make sure the Buckhead estate was entirely secure. She asked me to personally oversee the installation of a state-of-the-art high-definition security system, cameras at every entrance, the driveway, and the grand foyer, all wired directly to a secure cloud server that only I have the master password to. Vanessa froze. Her mouth hung open slightly, the breath catching sharply in her throat. She had lived in that house for years, but she was so incredibly self-absorbed, she had never paid attention to the small, discreet lenses tucked into the corners of the porch ceiling. Vanessa. I continued, turning my gaze to my sister, whose face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Did you really think I would leave a $50 million estate without making absolutely sure I had an insurance policy? Without waiting for her to answer, I tapped the screen of my phone. I synced it directly to the large, smart television mounted on the wall of the conference room. The screen flickered to life, instantly displaying the crisp night vision footage from the front porch of the Buckhead mansion. The timestamp in the corner clearly showed the date and time, just 3 hours after our mother was laid to rest. I turned the volume up to the maximum level. The high-quality audio captured the sound of the rain, followed instantly by the violent crashing sound of the heavy oak doors being thrown open. Everyone in the conference room watched the screen in absolute silence. There was my heavy leather suitcase skidding violently across the marble foyer and tumbling down the wet front steps, bursting open to spill my clothes everywhere. Then Vanessa stepped into the frame. She looked exactly as she had that night, wearing her designer morning gown, her face twisted in an ugly sneer. Her own voice, amplified through the boardroom speakers, filled the room with undeniable toxicity. "I told you to pack your trash and leave the digital," Vanessa hissed on screen. "Mom is dead. There is nobody left to protect a useless parasite like you. This is my property now, and I refuse to breathe the same air as a failure." The video continued to play flawlessly. Spencer appeared on screen, next leaning against the doorframe, swirling his glass of bourbon. "You should probably call an Uber." Naomi, his recorded voice, drawled with that sickening, condescending smirk. "Or maybe a city bus is more your speed these days. We simply do not house failures anymore. It is bad for the brand." I let the footage play out until the digital version of me calmly walked down the driveway and into the night. Then I tapped the screen again, cutting the feed. The television went black. The silence that slammed back into the conference room was absolute and suffocating. Vanessa looked like she was going to be physically sick. Her eyes were wide, staring blankly at the dark television screen, as if it were a ghost. Spencer was completely paralyzed in his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle twitched violently in his cheek. All their desperate lies, all their fake sympathy, and all their arrogant posturing had just been incinerated in less than 60 seconds. Mr. Harrison slowly took off his silver-rimmed reading glasses and placed them on top of the folder. He looked at Vanessa with a level of professional disgust that was truly beautiful to witness. "I believe the visual evidence is entirely unambiguous," Mr. Harrison said, his voice cold and devoid of any previous warmth. "You violently evicted your sister from the primary residence. You denied her shelter, and you explicitly claimed ownership of the property to force her removal." "Mr. Harrison." "Please," Vanessa begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Tears of genuine panic finally spilled over her perfectly contoured cheeks. "I was just angry. I did not mean it permanently. We were grieving. You cannot take everything away from me over one stupid fight." "It is not my decision to make, Vanessa," Mr. Harrison replied flatly. "I am simply the executor of the estate, and the instructions your mother left are legally binding and absolute." He picked up his expensive fountain pen and turned to the final page of the document. Let the record reflect that on this date, conclusive evidence has been presented proving that Vanessa Davis Sterling violated the primary contingency of the Beatrice Davis estate. Therefore, as mandated by the deceased, the primary inheritance clause is hereby officially revoked. He signed his name at the bottom of the page with a sharp, decisive stroke of black ink. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the room. It was the sound of $50 million slipping away forever. Effective immediately, Mr. Harrison announced, looking directly at me. The entirety of the liquid assets, the controlling shares of Davis Commercial Enterprises, and the deed to the Buckhead estate are transferred into the irrevocable blind trust. Naomi Davis is now the sole trustee and exclusive beneficiary. You own everything, Naomi. Vanessa let out a guttural, heart-wrenching sob, burying her face in her hands. She had lost her crown, her kingdom, and her entire future in the span of 5 minutes. But this was only the first phase of my revenge. She had lost the inheritance, but Spencer was about to lose his freedom. The sound of Vanessa sobbing was suddenly drowned out by a violent explosive crash. Spencer slammed both of his heavy fists down onto the polished mahogany table with such terrifying force that the coffee cups rattled violently against their saucers. His face had transformed from a pale, terrified white into an ugly mottled crimson. The veins in his neck bulged tightly against his expensive silk collar. He was no longer the composed, condescending venture capitalist who had smugly offered me $100 bill just 10 minutes earlier. He was a cornered animal realizing the golden cage he had built was actually a trap. He violently swept his arm across the table, knocking his custom leather briefcase onto the floor, scattering pens and blank legal pads everywhere. Mr. Harrison stood up, demanding order in his office, but Spencer completely ignored him. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the lawyer, then wildly swept it toward me and his own sobbing wife. "You people are absolutely unbelievable," Spencer spat, his voice laced with a venomous, unmasked hatred that completely stripped away every ounce of his polished society facade. "I knew I should never have gotten involved with a family like yours. You are all exactly the same. You get a little bit of money and you act like absolute savages, tearing each other apart over scraps. Your mother was nothing but a glorified slumlord who got lucky, and now you two are dragging her pathetic little legacy straight back into the gutter where it belongs." Vanessa stopped crying for a fraction of a second, looking up at the man she had married in absolute shock. Spencer had always pretended to respect my mother. He had always played the role of the progressive, supportive white ally in public, happily spending her money and using her connections. But now, deprived of his massive payday, his true colors bled aggressively through the expensive fabric of his tailored suit. He glared down at Vanessa, his face twisted in complete disgust. "And you," he snarled, kicking her chair slightly, "you stupid, incompetent woman. I brought you into high society. I gave you legitimacy. Before me, you were just another loud woman with a fake credit limit. I told you to just let her sleep in the basement. I told you to play nice until the ink on the will was dry. But you could not control your ghetto temper for one single night, could you? You had to drag her out onto the porch and scream like an uneducated animal right in front of a high-definition camera. You blew it. You blew everything." Vanessa shrank back into her chair, completely broken, unable to defend herself against the monster she had willingly brought into our home. She had traded her family for a man who viewed her as nothing more than an ATM, and now the machine was empty. Having verbally destroyed his wife, Spencer turned his full, unhinged fury entirely onto me. He marched around the large conference table, completely ignoring Mr. Harrison, pressing the security buzzer under his desk. Spencer stopped just inches away from where I was sitting calmly in my leather chair. He leaned over me, his face so close I could smell the stale alcohol and bitter coffee on his breath. "You think you have won, you pathetic little bitch," he hissed, a drop of spit flying from his lips. "You think you can steal $50 million from me with a cheap hidden camera trick? You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I manage a massive global hedge fund. I have billionaires on speed dial. I have an entire army of aggressive corporate defense attorneys on retainer who specialize in destroying people exactly like you." He slammed his hand against the back of my chair, trying desperately to physically intimidate me. I will file injunctions in federal court by noon today. He threatened, his voice echoing loudly in the enclosed space. I will claim you manipulated a dying woman. I will drag Beatrice's medical records into the public eye and prove she was mentally unfit. I will freeze every single asset in that blind trust. I will bury you in so much endless litigation that your grandchildren will still be paying my legal fees. I will have the court tie up this estate for the next 20 years. You will never see a single penny. You will be back to doing taxes in a rundown diner, and I will personally make sure you are completely bankrupt before the end of the fiscal year. I am going to crush you, Naomi. I am going to wipe your miserable existence off the map. He stood there, his chest heaving heavily, waiting for me to break. He expected me to cower. He expected the heavy weight of his white corporate intimidation to finally crack my composure. He expected tears of fear. He wanted me to beg him to call off his imaginary legal dogs. Instead, I slowly looked up at his sweating red face. I did not blink. I did not lean away from him. I did not show a single ounce of fear. I simply tilted my head slightly and let a slow, ice-cold, predatory smile spread across my face. It was the exact kind of smile that makes a predator suddenly realize it is actually the prey. Spencer saw that smile, and the aggressive fire in his eyes immediately flickered with a sudden icy jolt of deep uncertainty. He took a tiny, almost imperceptible step backward. He did not know that his loud threats of endless litigation were the absolute funniest thing I had heard all week. He did not know that I was fully aware his elite hedge fund was a total fabrication, and he was only seconds away from finding out that I was about to dismantle his entire life, not with a lawyer, but with a single stack of financial forensics. I slowly reached down and lifted my sleek black leather briefcase from the floor, placing it squarely on the mahogany conference table. The heavy metallic clicks of the brass latches echoing in the dead silent room sounded like a vault locking shut. Spencer watched my hands with wide, paranoid eyes. He had just threatened to bury me in corporate litigation, boasting about his army of defense attorneys. I was about to show him exactly what a real corporate execution looked like. I opened the briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of documents bound by a black binder clip. I did not toss it. I slammed it down onto the polished wood right in front of him. The loud thud made both him and Vanessa jump in their seats. A massive global hedge fund, I repeated, letting his own arrogant words roll off my tongue with a heavy dose of calculated mockery. That is what you just claimed, Spencer. You said you had billionaires on speed dial. You said you were a titan of high finance. But the truth is, you do not manage a hedge fund at all. You manage a very poorly constructed illusion. Spencer swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically from the stack of papers to my face. What is that? He demanded, his voice dropping to a nervous, raspy whisper. What did you bring in here? This is your entire life, Spencer, I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table. This is every single bank statement, wire transfer, and tax return you have filed for the last 5 years. You see, while you were busy playing the wealthy patriarch and telling me to take the bus, I was busy doing my actual job. I am a senior financial forensics investigator. I dismantle corrupt corporations for a living. And dismantling yours took me exactly 45 minutes. Vanessa snapped her head toward me, her tear-stained face twisted in total confusion. What are you talking about? She croaked, her voice trembling. Spencer is a venture capitalist. He runs Apex Global Solutions. I pulled the top document from the stack and slid it across the table toward her. Apex Global Solutions is not a venture capital firm, Vanessa. It is a shell company registered to a vacant strip mall in Delaware. It has 0 employees. It has 0 operational revenue. And it certainly has no billionaire investors. That is a lie, Spencer shouted, though his voice cracked pathetically. He slammed his hand on the table again, but there was no power behind it this time. She is forging documents, Harrison. You cannot believe a word this bitter woman says. She is just trying to humiliate me. I ignored his desperate outburst and pulled the next sheet of paper from the stack. I read directly from the highlighted lines, my voice projecting clearly and methodically. 2 years ago, Spencer Sterling quietly filed for Chapter 7, bankruptcy in federal court, under a dummy corporation to hide it from this family. You defaulted on 3 massive commercial loans. You maxed out 7 different corporate credit lines using fraudulent collateral. You have been entirely broke for 24 months, Spencer. You have been living completely on credit, leveraging your fake marriage to the Davis family name just to keep the collection agencies from seizing your leased luxury cars. The air was sucked completely out of the room. Vanessa stared at her husband, her jaw hanging open in pure horror. She had built her entire identity around being half of an elite, wealthy power couple. She had looked down on me, insulted me, and thrown me out of my own childhood home because she thought she was untouchable. Now she was realizing she had married a complete fraud. Spencer, Vanessa whispered, reaching out to grab his sleeve. Spencer, tell me she is lying. Tell me this is some kind of sick joke. Tell me we have the money. Spencer violently yanked his arm away from her, backing away from the table. Shut up, Vanessa, he hissed, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped rat looking for an exit. It is just a temporary cash flow issue. Every major investor goes through restructuring. I was going to use the $50 million from the inheritance to clear the books. I was going to fix it. You were going to use my mother money to pay off your massive gambling debts and your fraudulent offshore loans. I corrected him sharply, my voice cutting through his pathetic excuses. Let us look at the actual transactions, shall we? I picked up another sheet of paper and began reciting his financial sins line by line, tearing away every single layer of his white privileged armor. On October 12th, you transferred $200,000 from a joint account to a Cayman Islands holding company just to avoid a federal tax lien. On November 5th, you took out a second mortgage on a property you did not even legally own. You have been running a disorganized low-level Ponzi scheme, moving debt from one fake LLC to another just to keep the lights on. Every single word I spoke was a nail in his coffin. Mr. Harrison sat quietly observing the total destruction of the arrogant man who had disrespected him just moments ago. The lawyer did not intervene. He let me meticulously dismantle the fraud. Spencer was hyperventilating now, clutching the back of his chair to keep himself from collapsing. His face was a ghastly shade of gray. The tailored pinstripe suit he wore no longer looked like armor. It looked like a cheap costume. He had tried to use his race, his gender, and his fake corporate status to intimidate me. He had expected me to shrink in the presence of his loud, aggressive demands. But numbers do not care about your ego. Financial forensics do not care about how loud you yell. I had completely stripped him naked in front of his wife and the family lawyer. But I was not done. Bankrupting him and exposing his fake company was just the appetizer. The real devastation was still waiting in the final folder of my briefcase. Because Spencer had not just lost his own money, he had stolen from my mother. And the reason he stole that money was about to shatter Vanessa into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. I placed the bankruptcy documents down and looked directly into Spencer's terrified, bloodshot eyes. You are completely ruined financially, Spencer, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. But being broke is not the reason you are going to federal prison today. Let us talk about where you got the cash to survive for the last 3 years. Let us talk about the $3 million you embezzled from my mother. Spencer's breath caught sharply in his throat. He looked at the red manila folder I pulled from the back of my briefcase, as if it contained a live explosive. You are insane, he managed to whisper, though his eyes immediately darted toward the heavy oak doors of the conference room. I never touched Beatrice's accounts. I am a highly successful venture capitalist. I do not need her money. You were clever, I will give you that. I said, my voice eerily calm, completely ignoring his pathetic lies. You did not just wire the money into your own personal bank account. You created fake vendor invoices for commercial construction materials that were never ordered and never delivered. You routed the payments through 3 different subsidiary accounts before depositing them directly into your Cayman Islands shell company. $3.2 million over a period of 36 months. You bled her commercial real estate firm dry while she was undergoing chemotherapy, Spencer. You sat right by her hospital bed, held her hand, and siphoned her life work right out from under her. Vanessa shook her head slowly, the heavy diamond earrings dangling from her earlobes trembling. No, she muttered, looking desperately at her husband. Spencer, what is she talking about? You said the business was just having a slow quarter. Where did that money go? Did you lose it in the stock market? Tell me you just made a bad investment. Spencer could not even look at his wife. He stared down at his expensive Italian leather shoes, his hands shaking violently against his thighs. The arrogant white man who had mocked my cheap clothes and told me to take a city bus was completely paralyzing under the weight of his own financial crimes. He did not lose it in the market, Vanessa, I said, leaning back in my leather chair and folding my hands neatly on my lap. He invested it, just not in anything you would ever benefit from. I pulled a glossy, high-resolution photograph from the folder and slid it across the mahogany table. It was a picture of a stunning modern penthouse condominium located in the absolute most expensive district of Midtown Atlanta. This property was purchased 8 months ago, fully in cash, $2.4 million. Vanessa picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. Her eyes scanned the luxurious floor-to-ceiling windows and the sprawling rooftop terrace. Did you buy us a secondary property? She asked, a pathetic, desperate glimmer of hope still clinging to her voice. Did you put it in a hidden trust for us? I did not smile. The absolute cruelty of what Spencer had done was disgusting even to me. Look at the property deed attached to the back of the photograph, Vanessa. Look at the name. Vanessa flipped the photograph over. I watched her bloodshot eyes scan the legal document. I watched the exact moment her heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Who is Chloe Madison? Vanessa whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking the name aloud would make it real. Chloe Madison is 24 years old, I answered clearly, ensuring every single syllable hung heavily in the dead silent room. She is a blonde, blue-eyed Pilates instructor who moved here from Ohio 2 years ago. And according to these financial records, she is Spencer primary dependent. I pulled out a thick stack of credit card statements and threw them onto the center of the table. They fanned out perfectly, displaying rows and rows of luxury purchases. He used my mother money to buy Chloe that $2 million condo. He used my mother money to buy her a $90,000 Range Rover. Here are the receipts for their 2-week vacation to St. Bart's last December. The exact same week Spencer told you he was attending a venture capital conference in London. Here are the invoices from Cartier, Tiffany, and Van Cleef. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in diamond jewelry. He took the wealth built by a hard-working black woman, and he handed it directly to his young white mistress. Vanessa dropped the papers. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to her mouth to muffle the horrific guttural sound that tore its way out of her throat. It was the sound of a woman whose entire reality had just been violently ripped apart. She had alienated her only sister. She had turned a blind eye to our mother declining health. She had proudly played the role of the elite society wife looking down on everyone else. She had literally thrown me out into the pouring rain to protect her perfect marriage. All for a man who despised her, who viewed her as nothing more than a human ATM to fund his secret life with a woman 12 years younger. You stole from my mother, Vanessa, screamed the sound echoing painfully off the wood-paneled walls. She lunged across the space between them, her manicured nails digging fiercely into the lapels of his custom pinstripe suit. You stole from my family to buy a house for a stupid little girl. You used me. You absolutely used me. Spencer desperately tried to push her off his face, contorted in a mixture of blind panic and sudden violent rage. Get off me, you crazy woman, he yelled, shoving her back with so much force that she stumbled and crashed hard into the edge of the conference table. The physical shove broke the last remaining thread of Vanessa's sanity. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing hysterically, completely stripped of her pride, her ego, and her $50 million inheritance. She was nothing but a broken woman crying on an oriental rug surrounded by the receipts of her own profound betrayal. Spencer stood over her, his chest heaving, his tie crooked and pulled completely askew. The polished veneer of the sophisticated venture capitalist was gone forever. "You think I wanted this?" he shouted, looking frantically between me, Vanessa, and Mr. Harrison. "You think I wanted to be tied to this suffocating family? I deserved that money. I put up with your endless family drama. I put up with Beatrice constantly lecturing me. I earned every single penny of that $3 million. I watched him unravel with absolute cold detachment. He had finally admitted it out loud, right in front of the estate lawyer. "You earned nothing," I said, my voice slicing effortlessly through his hysterical, pathetic rant. "You are a thief, Spencer. A cheap, arrogant, incredibly sloppy thief. And unfortunately for you, my mother commercial real estate company was heavily federally insured." Spencer froze. His bloodshot eyes snapped back to me. The color that had rushed to his face from fighting with Vanessa suddenly drained completely away, leaving him looking like a corpse. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice trembling with sheer terror. I reached into my pocket and casually checked my watch. "I sent the unredacted files to the federal authorities last night," I replied. Right on cue, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the law office. The heavy footsteps echoing in the hallway outside Mr. Harrison's office sounded like the steady beat of an executioner drum. Spencer's eyes darted wildly toward the closed oak doors. The absolute reality of his situation finally crashed down upon him. He was not just broke. He was not just losing his wealthy wife. He was about to lose his freedom. The federal government does not play games with wire fraud, and they certainly do not offer plea deals to men who leave a perfectly documented paper trail of money laundering across international borders. For a split second, nobody moved. Then pure animal panic completely overrode whatever remained of Spencer's rational brain. He let out a desperate guttural sound and lunged across the mahogany table. He wildly swiped at the stack of financial forensics I had just laid out, frantically trying to gather the glossy photographs, the Cayman Islands bank statements, and the forged commercial invoices. He scrambled to stuff the papers into his leather briefcase, his hands shaking so violently that half of the documents fluttered uselessly to the floor, landing right next to his sobbing wife. "What are you doing, Spencer?" Mr. Harrison demanded, standing up and pointing a stern finger at the frantic man. "You cannot destroy evidence in a law office. Stop right there." "Shut up, old man," Spencer yelled, his voice cracking with pure terror. He managed to shove a handful of crumpled papers into his bag and snapped the brass latches shut. He did not care about Vanessa. He did not stop to help her up from the floor. He did not even look at her. His only thought was self-preservation. He spun around, clutching his briefcase to his chest like a shield, and sprinted directly toward the heavy oak doors. He thought he could just walk out. He genuinely believed his white privilege and his expensive tailored suit would somehow allow him to casually stroll past federal agents and disappear into the busy streets of downtown Atlanta. He was completely wrong. Just as his hand reached out to grab the brass handle, the heavy doors violently swung inward. Spencer stumbled backward, crying out as the solid wood struck his shoulder. 3 men wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across the back stepped into the conference room. They moved with absolute tactical precision, immediately taking control of the space. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern face and a clipped military haircut, stepped directly in front of Spencer, completely blocking his path to freedom. Spencer Sterling, the lead agent, said, his voice booming with undeniable federal authority. He did not ask. He stated it as an absolute fact. Spencer backed away, clutching his briefcase tighter, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "There has been a mistake," he stammered, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. "You have the wrong man. I am a respected venture capitalist. I am a member of the Magnolia Country Club. I demand to call my corporate attorneys right now." The lead agent did not even blink. He reached to his belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "Spencer Sterling, You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, international money laundering, and corporate embezzlement, the agent recited smoothly, stepping forward and firmly grabbing Spencer by the shoulder. We have a federal warrant for your arrest and a separate warrant to seize all assets tied to Apex Global Solutions and your offshore Cayman accounts. No! Spencer screamed, thrashing wildly as the agent spun him around and slammed him face first against the polished mahogany table. Let me go. You do not understand. My wife is inheriting $50 million. We can pay the money back. We can pay the fines. Just let me make a phone call. The sound of the cold steel ratcheting tightly around Spencer's wrists echoed sharply through the room. It was the absolute sweetest sound I had ever heard. The second agent effortlessly pried the leather briefcase from Spencer's desperate grip. The third agent began reading him his Miranda rights, his voice a steady, monotonous drone that completely drowned out Spencer, pathetic, high-pitched sobbing. I remained perfectly seated in my leather chair, watching the entire scene unfold with absolute satisfaction. Vanessa had stopped crying. She was sitting frozen on the floor, her makeup completely ruined, watching in pure shock as the federal agents pinned her husband to the table. The man she had chosen over her own blood, the man she had allowed to disrespect our mother and humiliate me, was now weeping like a terrified child. Please, Vanessa, tell them, Spencer begged, twisting his neck to look at his wife, as the agents pulled him back to his feet. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them your mother gave me that money. Tell them, please. Vanessa just stared at him. She looked at his crooked silk tie, his red tear-stained face, and the steel cuffs locked securely around his wrists. Then she looked at the photograph of the $2 million condo he had bought for his young blonde mistress, which was still resting on the floor right next to her knee. She did not say a single word. The illusion was completely shattered. She finally saw him for exactly what he was: a parasite. Take him out, the lead agent ordered. The agents grabbed Spencer by the arms and began marching him out of the law office. He continued to scream and beg, his voice echoing loudly down the hallway, getting fainter and fainter as they dragged him toward the elevators. The entire firm had stopped working to watch the wealthy, arrogant Spencer Sterling get hauled away in handcuffs. The absolute public humiliation he had tried to inflict on me at the country club the night before had just been returned to him 1,000 times over. The lead agent lingered in the doorway for a brief moment. He looked over at me, giving a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. The forensic files I had uploaded to the Federal Cybercrime Division the night before had been a masterpiece of investigative accounting. I had essentially gift-wrapped a massive financial criminal and handed him directly to the Department of Justice on a silver platter. The agent turned and walked out, pulling the heavy oak doors shut behind him. The click of the latch snapping into place signaled the absolute end of Spencer Sterling. He was going to a federal penitentiary for a very long time. The conference room was suddenly incredibly quiet again. Mr. Harrison slowly adjusted his suit jacket, deeply exhaling as he sat back down at the head of the table. He looked exhausted, but entirely relieved to have the criminal removed from his office. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was still warm. The first phase of my mother final will had been executed flawlessly. The massive inheritance was securely in my name, and the white con artist who had stolen from her legacy was currently riding the elevator down to a federal holding cell. But the morning was not over yet. I slowly turned my chair and looked down at my sister. Vanessa was still sitting on the floor, completely broken, surrounded by the scattered evidence of her ruined life. She had absolutely nothing left, and I knew exactly what was coming next. She was going to experience the true crushing weight of her own arrogance. The speed at which high society will abandon you is truly a spectacular thing to witness. It took exactly 48 hours for Vanessa's entire universe to completely disintegrate. When you build your entire identity on the foundation of money status and the perception of power, your fall from grace is not a slow descent. It is an absolute freefall. And Vanessa hit the concrete at terminal velocity. It started with the banks. The morning after Spencer was dragged out of the law office in handcuffs, Vanessa tried to purchase a first-class ticket to Miami. She wanted to escape the city to run away from the whispers and the humiliating reality of her situation. She handed her heavy metal credit card to the concierge at the St. Regis, expecting the usual deferential treatment. Instead, the card was declined. She pulled out another card. Declined. She logged into her mobile banking app, her hands shaking with mounting panic. Every single account she had access to displayed a massive red banner, account frozen by federal mandate. Because Spencer had used their joint accounts to funnel the embezzled money to his mistress and his offshore shell companies, the FBI had placed a hard freeze on every single dime attached to the sterling name. Vanessa had no access to the liquid cash she had spent the last 5 days bragging about. She had no access to her own savings. She could not even buy a cup of coffee. She was trapped in Atlanta, forced to face the exact people she had just spent years looking down upon. And the elite African American community of Atlanta is a very small, very well-connected circle. News of an FBI raid and a massive embezzlement scandal does not just walk through the grapevine, it sprints. By Tuesday evening, Vanessa's face was plastered across the digital pages of every local society blog. The details of Spencer's secret white mistress and his fake venture capital firm were the only things being discussed in the boardrooms, the beauty salons, and the exclusive dining rooms across Buckhead. Vanessa desperately scrolled through her phone, calling the women she considered her closest friends. She called the wives of state senators, the daughters of wealthy surgeons, the women who had happily drunk her expensive champagne and cheered for her at the country club just a few nights prior. Nobody answered. Her calls went straight to voicemail. Her text messages were left unread. The women who had constantly praised her designer clothes and begged for invitations to her dinner parties evaporated into thin air. They were terrified of the federal investigation. They were terrified of being associated with a disgraced criminal. In the ruthless world of high society, loyalty is only leased, and Vanessa Lease had just been permanently terminated. Refusing to accept her new reality, Vanessa made a completely desperate, incredibly foolish decision. She put on her expensive sunglasses, dressed in her finest silk blouse, and ordered a rideshare to the Magnolia Country Club. She thought she could march into the dining room, put on a brave face, and manipulate the narrative. She thought she could play the victim, claiming she was just an innocent wife deceived by a terrible man. But she never even made it past the front gates. When the rideshare pulled up to the grand entrance, the security guards immediately stepped out and blocked the vehicle. Richard Sterling, the club president, who had personally escorted me into the ballroom just a few days ago, walked out of the guardhouse. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He stood at the window of the car and looked down at Vanessa with an expression of pure glacial detachment. "You are no longer welcome here, Vanessa," Richard said, his voice flat and authoritative. "Your membership has been officially revoked by a unanimous vote from the board of directors. Your husband is currently sitting in a federal holding cell, and your presence is a massive disruption to our members." Vanessa rolled down the window, her face flushing a deep, humiliating red. "Richard, please," she begged, her voice cracking, as the rideshare driver awkwardly listened to the entire exchange. "I had nothing to do with Spencer business. You have known my family for years. My mother helped build this club. You cannot just turn me away like a common criminal." Richard did not flinch. "Your mother was a woman of absolute integrity," he replied coldly. "Do not use her name to shield yourself from the mess you created. You stood on our stage and publicly humiliated your own sister. You paraded a con artist through our halls. We value discretion and honor, Vanessa. You possess neither. Turn the car around. If you attempt to enter this property again, I will have you arrested for trespassing." He turned his back and walked away. The security guards aggressively signaled for the driver to leave. Vanessa was forced to sit in the back of a cheap sedan, weeping silently behind her dark sunglasses as she was driven away from the only world she had ever cared about. But the absolute climax of her humiliation was waiting for her when she returned to the luxury townhouse she and Spencer had been renting. As the rideshare pulled onto the quiet tree-lined street, Vanessa saw two massive commercial tow trucks parked directly in front of her driveway. Men in heavy work boots were securing heavy metal chains to the wheels of her pristine white Range Rover. Another man was already hoisting Spencer Custom Bentley onto the flatbed of the second truck. Vanessa scrambled out of the car, sprinting up the driveway, screaming at the men to stop. She waved her arms frantically, threatening to call the police, threatening to sue them, demanding they unhook her vehicles immediately. The lead repossession agent simply pulled a thick stack of paperwork from his clipboard and held it out to her. He looked completely bored, entirely unfazed by her designer clothes or her hysterical screaming. "These vehicles are leased under Apex Global Solutions," the agent stated, tapping a thick finger against the highlighted text. "The company has defaulted on 6 consecutive payments. The bank has officially repossessed both assets. Step away from the truck, ma'am, or I will call the police myself." Vanessa stood on the manicured lawn of a house she could no longer afford, watching the tow trucks drive away with the last remaining symbols of her fake wealth. She had no money, she had no cars, she had no friends. Her husband was a federal prisoner who had spent her family money on a young blonde mistress. The $50 million inheritance she had bragged about was permanently locked away in a trust controlled by the very sister she had thrown out into the rain. In less than 48 hours, the golden child of the Davis family had been completely, utterly annihilated. She had fallen from the absolute peak of Atlanta high society and crashed violently into rock bottom. And as she sat alone on her front steps, watching the sun set over a city that had completely turned its back on her, she finally realized there was only one person left in the entire world she could call: me. But Vanessa was not the only one who suddenly remembered my phone number that afternoon. Long before my sister even figured out how to dial my number through her tears of humiliation, my phone had already started ringing. In fact, it had not stopped vibrating since the news of Spencer getting arrested by federal agents broke on the local morning broadcasts. The extended Davis family, the exact same people who had stood silently on a wet driveway and watched me get thrown out of my childhood home like a piece of garbage, had suddenly experienced a miraculous change of heart. The notifications flooded my screen in an endless, pathetic wave of sheer hypocrisy. Aunt Denise left 6 voicemails in the span of 2 hours. Uncle Jerome sent a string of incredibly lengthy text messages filled with praying hands emojis. Cousin Marcus, the man who had refused to even make eye contact with me at my own mother's funeral, suddenly sent me a digital invitation to his daughter's upcoming birthday party. It was a complete masterclass in emotional manipulation and absolute shamelessness. I sat on my velvet sofa sipping a hot cup of chamomile tea, listening to Aunt Denise's frantic voice echoing through my high-end penthouse speakers. "Oh, Naomi, sweetheart," Denise cooed in her third voicemail, her voice dripping with a thick, sugary, entirely fake affection. "I have just been weeping all morning. My heart is completely broken over this ugly situation with Spencer and Vanessa. You know your auntie always loved you, baby. We need to come together right now as a family. The devil is trying to tear this family apart, but we need to focus on healing and forgiveness. Blood is thicker than water, Naomi. Call me back so we can plan a family dinner. I will make your absolute favorite sweet potato pie." I actually laughed out loud at the sheer unadulterated audacity. Blood is thicker than water. That is always the favorite battle cry of toxic relatives who want access to your resources without ever taking an ounce of accountability for their abuse. Where was that thick blood when Denise was standing in the pouring rain calling me a broke, ungrateful mistake? Where was that desperate desire for family healing when Uncle Jerome stood quietly under his umbrella and watched a white con artist mock my cheap clothes and tell me to ride a city bus? They did not want healing. They wanted funding. They had spent the last several days banking their entire financial survival on Vanessa's new $50 million inheritance. They had eagerly kissed the ring of the golden child, entirely willing to throw me to the wolves just to secure their monthly allowances. But now, the wolves had come for Spencer, and Vanessa was completely bankrupt. The massive Davis family gravy train had violently derailed, and they suddenly realized that the sister they had discarded was now the sole trustee of the entire empire. I was the bank, and they were desperately trying to reopen their accounts using cheap flattery and religious guilt trips. I placed my teacup gently on the glass coffee table. I was not going to play their twisted game of emotional manipulation. I was not going to let them pretend the last week had not happened. I picked up my smartphone and opened the massive family group chat. There were over 20 relatives in that digital space. For years, I had been the silent observer in that chat, watching them praise Vanessa daily while completely ignoring my existence. I did not type out a long emotional paragraph. I did not want them to dissect my punctuation or misinterpret my tone. I wanted them to hear the absolute freezing calm in my voice. I held down the microphone icon at the bottom of the screen and began recording my final message to the Davis family. "Good afternoon, family," I said, my voice perfectly steady, carrying the quiet, undeniable authority of a woman who held every single card in the deck. "I have received all your calls, your texts, and your beautiful prayers for healing. It is truly fascinating how quickly you all found my phone number after completely forgetting it 3 days ago. Aunt Denise, your offer to make sweet potato pie is very generous. But the last time we spoke, you told me to get on my knees and beg for forgiveness from a woman who just threw my belongings onto the street. You called me a stray dog. You explicitly told me I was dead to this family." I paused for a single beat, letting the heavy weight of my words sink into the audio recording. Do not mistake my silence over the years for stupidity. I know exactly why my phone is ringing today. It is not because you love me. It is not because you suddenly realize the error of your ways. It is because the bank accounts have been frozen and you just found out that I'm sitting on top of $50 million. You do not want a niece, a cousin, or a sister. You want an ATM. You enabled my abuse my entire life because it was financially convenient for you. You stood by and watched me be treated like a second-class citizen in my own home simply because Vanessa wrote the checks. I took a slow breath, delivering the final crushing blow. Well, the checks have officially stopped bouncing. I am the sole owner of Davis Commercial Enterprises, and my very first act as the chief executive officer is cutting off the dead weight. Every single monthly allowance is permanently canceled. The credit cards in my mother name that you have been using for years are officially deactivated. Do not call my phone. Do not show up at my corporate office. And absolutely do not show up at my home. You chose your side on the night of the funeral. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. Enjoy the rest of your lives. I lifted my finger off the screen, sending the audio file directly into the chat. I watched the little circle spin for a fraction of a second before the message successfully delivered to all 23 family members. I did not wait to see the frantic typing bubbles pop up at the bottom of the screen. I did not wait for the inevitable barrage of defensive replies, the desperate crying apologies, or the angry accusations of being a bitter, unforgiving woman. They had lost their power to hurt me, and they had lost their power to drain me. I tapped the settings icon in the top right corner of the screen. I selected the option to permanently delete the group chat. Then, moving with methodical precision, I went directly into my contact list. Aunt Denise. Blocked. Uncle Jerome. Blocked. Cousin Marcus. Blocked. I went down the entire list, erasing their digital access to my life, one by one. Each press of the screen felt like cutting a heavy, suffocating chain that had been tightly wrapped around my neck since childhood. When the list was completely clear, I placed the phone face down on the table. The silence in my penthouse was absolute and incredibly beautiful. I had not just secured my financial future today. I had completely amputated the toxic bloodline that had poisoned my family for decades. I was finally truly free from their judgments and their greed. But there was still one loose end out there in the city, sitting alone in the dark, completely out of options, and desperate for a lifeline. Exactly 7 days had passed since the explosive reading of the will. 7 days of absolute silence from the toxic bloodline I had severed. The city of Atlanta was currently being battered by a massive, relentless rainstorm. The sky was a bruised, heavy purple, pouring sheets of freezing water onto the streets below. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, holding a glass of vintage red wine, watching the lightning arc across the skyline. The violent weather felt incredibly poetic. It was the exact same kind of storm that had raged on the night of my mother's funeral, the night my entire life changed. But tonight I was not standing in the freezing rain. I was warm, secure, and entirely untouchable in my fortress in the sky. The peaceful silence of my evening was suddenly interrupted by the sharp buzz of the private security intercom mounted on the wall. I walked over and pressed the glowing button. It was Marcus, the head of night security for the building. "Boss, we have a situation at the front gate." His deep voice crackled through the speaker. "There is a woman out here demanding to be let up. She is completely drenched and looks like she has been sleeping on the street. She knows your name and your penthouse number, and she keeps screaming that she is your sister. Do you want me to call the police and have her removed for trespassing?" I tapped the screen to access the live feed from the front gate security cameras. The high-definition night vision immediately displayed the bleak scene outside. My breath hitched just slightly at the absolute poetic justice of the image. It was Vanessa. But she was entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, sequin-clad socialite who had tried to humiliate me at the country club just a week ago. Her expensive hair extensions were matted and plastered to her face. Her clothes were soaked and wrinkled. But the detail that truly solidified the absolute perfection of this moment was the luggage she was holding. She was tightly gripping the handle of a heavy, scuffed leather suitcase. It was my suitcase. The exact same suitcase she had violently thrown down the marble stairs of the Buckhead estate. She had actually gone back to the mansion, packed whatever meager belongings the federal agents had not seized, and used the very bag she had once tossed into the mud. "Tell the guards to stand down," I instructed Marcus through the intercom. "I am coming down to the lobby." I set my wine glass on the counter and walked to the private elevator. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a sudden rush of sisterly compassion. I only felt the cold, hard necessity of closing this chapter forever. The elevator doors slid open to the grand, double-height glass lobby of my building. The storm was howling against the reinforced glass walls, rattling the heavy metal frames. Marcus was waiting for me near the front doors, holding a massive, heavy-duty black umbrella. I nodded to him, and he pushed open the heavy glass door just enough for us to step out onto the sheltered overhang. The freezing wind immediately whipped around my ankles, but Marcus held the umbrella firmly over my head, completely shielding me from the violent downpour. Vanessa was standing 10 feet away, completely exposed to the elements, shivering violently under the pouring rain. When she saw me step out into the light, she let out a pathetic, desperate sob. She stumbled forward, the wheels of the heavy leather suitcase scraping harshly against the wet concrete. "Naomi," she cried out, her voice barely audible over the sound of the crashing thunder. "Thank God. Please, Naomi, tell them to let me in. I have been walking for 2 miles. I am freezing. I have absolutely nowhere else to go." She stopped just at the edge of the dry concrete, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. The heavy designer makeup she used to wear was completely washed away, leaving her face looking pale and hollow. The federal agents locked the doors to the townhouse. She sobbed, wrapping her arms around herself to stop the violent shivering. They froze every single account. They took my credit cards. I tried to call Aunt Denise, but she blocked my number. Everybody blocked my number. I have not eaten since yesterday. Please just let me sleep on your couch for a few nights. Just until I can figure this out. I can help you clean. I can do whatever you need. Just do not leave me out here. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the broken woman shivering in the rain. The visual symmetry of the moment was absolutely stunning. Just 1 week ago, our positions were entirely reversed. She was the one standing on a dry, elevated porch, wrapped in expensive fabric, looking down at me with pure disgust. She was the one who told me to call a city bus. She was the one who proudly declared that she did not house failures. The universe had taken her arrogant words and forcefully shoved them right back down her throat. She was now the failure standing in the rain, dragging the exact same suitcase, begging for the exact same mercy she had ruthlessly denied me. It was all Spencer. Vanessa cried desperately, trying to read my silent, stoic expression. It was all him, Naomi. He lied to me. He manipulated me. I never wanted to throw you out of the house. He made me do it. He told me it was the only way to protect the company. You have to believe me. We are sisters. We share the same blood. You cannot just watch me freeze to death on the street. Our mother would never want this. She would want us to forgive each other. She was still lying. Even at rock bottom, stripped of all her wealth and status, she was still completely incapable of taking accountability for her own vile actions. She was perfectly willing to throw her criminal husband under the bus if it meant securing a warm bed for the night. She weaponized our mother memory, the exact same memory she had disrespected by letting a white con artist embezzle millions of dollars from her legacy. I looked at the heavy leather suitcase resting in the puddles at her feet. The zipper was still slightly broken from when she had thrown it onto the driveway 7 days ago. The absolute audacity she possessed to pack her things in the symbol of my humiliation and drag it to my doorstep was staggering. Vanessa's legs suddenly gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the wet concrete, her knees splashing into a puddle of freezing rain. She threw her hands over her face and wailed a terrible, desperate sound that was entirely swallowed by the crashing thunder. I just need a place to sleep tonight, she begged, her voice raw and breaking. I need money for a divorce attorney. I have to divorce him, Naomi. He ruined my life. I will pay you back every single cent. I will work for you. Just please do not leave me out here like this. I am your sister. I looked down at the woman kneeling in the puddles. This was the same woman who had spent 36 years treating me like a second-class citizen. The same woman who had proudly stood on a stage just a few days ago, publicly declaring that she was cutting the dead weight from our family. She was not crying because she felt remorse for how she had treated me. She was crying because her golden parachute had failed to open and she had hit the ground hard. She was mourning her lost wealth, her lost status, and her lost pride. She was not apologizing to me. She was begging my bank account for a bailout. I did not step out from under the heavy black umbrella. I did not reach out to help her up. I stood perfectly straight, the warm, dry air from the luxury lobby at my back, contrasting sharply with the freezing storm in front of me. You were right, Vanessa, I said. My voice was incredibly calm, but it cut through the heavy rain and the howling wind like shattered glass. Vanessa stopped crying for a fraction of a second, looking up at me with desperate mascara, stained eyes desperately hoping for a sliver of mercy. On the night of the funeral, you made your feelings perfectly clear. I continued, my tone completely devoid of any emotion. You looked me right in the eyes and told me I meant absolutely nothing to you. You told me I was dead to you. You made a choice to erase me from your life when you thought you held all the power. So you need to stand by that choice now. To you, I mean nothing. So stop begging a ghost. Clean up your own mess. I did not wait for her response. I turned my back on her and walked back through the heavy glass doors of the lobby. Marcus followed closely behind me, shaking the rain from the large umbrella before taking his position back at the security desk. I walked straight into my private glass elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse. Through the transparent walls, I could see Vanessa still kneeling on the concrete, clutching the wet leather suitcase, screaming my name into the night. The heavy steel doors slid silently shut, cutting off the sound of her voice, and the storm outside completely. I was finally, truly free. The morning after that storm marked the absolute beginning of my true life. I did not waste a single second looking back at the wreckage of the Davis family. Instead, I walked straight into the towering glass headquarters of Davis Commercial Enterprises, not as the family scapegoat, but as the sole chief executive officer. The corporate boardroom that Vanessa had so arrogantly planned to dominate was now entirely mine. My first official act was a complete, merciless purge. I fired every single executive board member who had turned a blind eye to Spencer and his fraudulent accounting. I brought in my own elite team of forensic auditors, aggressively stripping away the rotten financial architecture he had built and recovering whatever capital the federal government had not already seized for restitution. We did not just restructure the company, we completely rebranded it. I stripped away the old corporate identity that had been tainted by greed and complacency, transforming the empire into a modernized, transparent powerhouse. But the hardest part of the rebuilding process did not happen in the boardroom. It happened inside my own mind. For 32 years, my entire existence had been defined by my proximity to a deeply toxic family. I had built my career around hiding in the shadows, waiting for the inevitable moment of betrayal. When you spend your entire life bracing for a punch, the sudden absence of violence feels incredibly disorienting. There were quiet nights in my penthouse when the absolute silence of my blocked phone felt heavier than the screaming matches ever did. I had to learn how to exist without the constant suffocating weight of their expectations. I had to forgive my mother for the environment she allowed to fester, while simultaneously honoring the incredible empire she managed to build. Healing from family trauma is not just about aggressively cutting off the infected branches. It is about actively cultivating new healthy roots. I realized that my highly specialized skills in financial forensics could be used for something far greater than just personal revenge. 6 months after Spencer was formally sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary, I launched the Beatrice Davis Legal Aid Foundation. It was a fully funded, aggressive legal strike force dedicated specifically to protecting women of color who were victims of financial abuse and corporate fraud. We provided elite forensic accountants and ruthless defense attorneys to women whose husbands, partners, or even families had tried to trap them using money as a weapon. I took the exact pain my family had inflicted on me and weaponized it into an unshakable shield for others. I built a legacy that Vanessa could never even comprehend, one rooted in absolute empowerment rather than shallow high society validation. The empire was finally clean, and for the first time in my life, I was building something that truly belonged to me. I sit here now in the quiet comfort of my living room, the camera focused closely on my face. The violent storm that ravaged the city that week has long since passed, replaced by clear skies and the endless glittering lights of the Atlanta skyline stretching out before me. Looking back on the night of my mother's funeral and the chaotic, destructive days that followed, I realized something profoundly important. We are often taught from a very young age that family is absolute. We are conditioned to believe that sharing the same DNA means we must unconditionally endure whatever cruel treatment they decide to inflict upon us. Society tells us to keep family secrets hidden, to turn the other cheek, to suffer in silence for the sake of preserving a broken picture. But I am here to tell you with absolute certainty that blood is never an excuse to tolerate emotional abuse. For years, I let my sister and her husband diminish my worth, because I thought keeping the peace was my duty as the younger sibling. I thought staying quiet made me the bigger person. But silence in the face of absolute disrespect is not strength. It is self-betrayal. You do not owe your peace of mind to people who actively plot your downfall. You do not owe your loyalty to people who only value you when you are convenient or profitable. Every time I look at the women walking through the doors of my legal foundation, I see the same initial fear I once carried. But I also get to witness their incredible transformation as they take their power back. I have forgiven Vanessa. I truly have. Holding on to the intense, bitter anger of what she and Spencer did would only poison the beautiful, peaceful life I have built. I do not wish her harm, but I also do not wish her access. Forgiving someone does not mean you have to give them a front row seat to your life ever again. Forgiveness simply means accepting the reality of who they are, letting go of the heavy resentment, and walking forward without them. My boundaries are set in solid stone, and my peace is fiercely protected. If you are watching this right now and you are currently trapped in the dark shadow of a toxic family dynamic, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your fundamental worth is not determined by how your family treats you. Your future is not permanently dictated by the unfair labels they forced upon you. You have the absolute power to walk away from the table when respect is no longer being served. It takes incredible courage to pack your bags and walk out into a raging storm alone. But I promise you, the beautiful peace you will find on the other side is worth every single painful step. I lift my porcelain teacup, feeling the gentle, comforting warmth radiating against my palms. I take a slow, quiet sip, savoring the rich flavor and the absolute breathtaking stillness of my home. I look out through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the vibrant, glowing Atlanta skyline stretching endlessly before me. They threw my belongings onto the street. They mocked my existence. They tried to bury me, but they did not know I was a seed.